If you've seen any of my past videos on Hollow Knight, you'll know that Christopher Larkin, the game's composer, deals with his themes carefully and deliberately. Leitmotifs, or melodies that represent a different idea or figure in a story, are woven throughout his soundtracks, becoming a part of the game's world, lending additional layers of depth and meaning to be mined from a game that gives players very little straightforward information about what's happening. Silksong, the successor to Hollow Knight, is no different, and there's one motif in particular that's threaded through every nook and cranny of the game's musical world. It's even the first thing you hear when you start up the game. This short 4-note motif actually has a long history and a Latin name. It's called the Dies Irae. The Dies Irae is a melody that dates all the way back to the 13th century, a Gregorian chant written to a Latin poem describing the Last Judgment, the day when the trumpet calls and our souls are brought before God to be judged. This melody, particularly the first 4 notes, has become a sort of musical representation of death. The Dies Irae was traditionally performed as a part of the Catholic Requiem Mass, so would have associations with funeral services to the average medieval person. And then starting with Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique became a reference composers would make to evoke the inescapable nature of death. To this day, this figure is used in film scores as a musical shorthand for death and dying. The motif goes like this, starting on the flat third in a minor key. It works so well as an allusion to death because of its severity and its finality. The opening semitone motion introduces a sense of gravity to the melody, and then the leap down to the root feels like a door closing in your face. The full phrase ends with another resolution to the tonic of our minor key, this 2 to flat 7 in closure, landing on the 1 to lay the melody to rest. But Larkin tends to let this melody hang on the second. The second in a minor key is an emotionally potent note, and ending a phrase with this kind of color and weight is a hallmark of Larkin's writing. Once you start to notice this phrase showing up in the game, you won't be able to stop. Take the music that plays when you find a bench. The soothing harp and synth pad spell out a series of stacks of fourth intervals, and then in comes this melody. You'll notice the same shape as the first 4 notes of the Dies Irae melody, stepping down and back up and then jumping down a third, but this motif first outlines a major third between E and C, rather than the minor third of the original Dies Irae. This same shape moves down the scale in step until it comes to make the exact Dies Irae statement in the key of A minor, over top of E sus and D sus chords. This major key Dies Irae, or rather the Dies Irae figure moved to start on the 5th of a minor key rather than the flat third, is a variant that Larkin uses all over the game's soundtrack, and it becomes sort of like the Silksong version of the Dies Irae, still evocative of the same implications as the original but easier to use in softer musical contexts. The music for Songclave begins with this exact motif, 5-4-5 flat 3, starting off the main melody in G minor. The theme of Bellheart uses the same motif again in the key of E flat minor this time, but spins it into an entirely new melody. The song that Hornet plays on her Needle-In uses the same motif too. If we remove the triplet arpeggios filling in the space between each top note, it's easy to see this same motif as the melody, starting on the 5th in our key of D minor and following the same shape, even giving us the classic Dies Irae figure starting on the flat 3rd of the key after. Even the bells that chime when you activate some of the benches around Farloom come down and clang out the original Dies Irae motif. It's not overused, but this figure is definitely a large part of the game's music. So why is this 800-year-old funeral procession melody so prominent in this game? Is Larkin just trying to be a downer or what? My reading is that it has sort of a dual meaning. Farloom is a dying land. Its caverns and tunnels are littered with dead bugs, puppeted by the silk threads that have infested every corner of the kingdom. When you make it up to the Citadel, you discover that the elite there were conducting sick experiments to try and attain immortality, and in defying God's natural order, in trying to eliminate death, they've actually surrounded themselves with it. The Citadel is one gigantic mausoleum, the stench of death entrenched throughout the city, and with it the Dies Irae theme. The other reading is that the Dies Irae motif here is the theme for the Grand Silkmother, the creature responsible for the silk that's had all of Farloom in its grip. This omnipresence of the silk throughout the world would explain this motif poking its head up in so many different places, and this relation is enforced by the Silkmother's boss theme. When you approach the Silkmother's resting place, the cradle, the first 3 notes of the Silksong Dies Irae motif float around in these ethereal synth pads. The closer you get to the top of the cradle, the more layers are added to the music, the pads swelling with intensity and a violin coming in to emphasize the Dies Irae motif. When you finally make it up to the top and challenge the Silkmother to battle, her battle theme is made up entirely of this Dies Irae motif. This is not hyperbole. Her battle theme is really a giant web where every strand is made up of some variation of the simple 4-note figure, like a giant musical fractal. First, the motif is moved down in sequence to build a melody in exactly the same way we saw in the bench theme, starting on the 5th and ending on the classic Dies Irae formation in A minor. But this time, this melody is played as a series of pounding quarter notes in 4/4 time, rather than the floaty 3/4 rhythms that made up the bench theme. After this, the strings take the classic Dies Irae figure and shorten it into an 8th note ostinato line, playing in the background as the horns come in to build a melody off of the same Dies Irae motif in half notes underneath. This horn melody hangs on the 2nd of the key at the end for extra emotional potency, the way Larkin loves to do, and being belted out by the horns and choir gives this melody that epic final boss quality. The softer Silksong version of the Dies Irae combines with the 13th century original as these melodies come together in harmony in the high strings, accompanied by the trombone's staccato chord stabs. Even in this trombone part, the top voice also follows the same Dies Irae shape. It's impossible to escape from this motif, but the phrase doesn't end the way you'd expect. This time, the ending of the melody features these gross chromatic shifting chords over top of a bass pedal. A minor to G sharp minor over A to A minor, used to harmonize, once again, that Dies Irae motif, and then what might be the only example I've ever seen in my life of a dominant chord resolving to a diminished chord with the following B diminished 7 to F sharp 7 to B diminished 7. Crazy. When you reach the second phase of the fight, the music kicks into another gear. The bass begins hammering offbeats to drive the rhythmic intensity, and a new melody kicks in. Well, not that new. This time, the Dies Irae shape is answered by a new figure made up of old parts. A 3-note walk up the scale followed by another lower neighbor dip. This answering bar is not far from the original Dies Irae motif at all, but it's fresh enough to be used as new material to expand upon. For example, this figure gets used to crawl through some pretty hairy harmony. We go from F minor to E to G sharp minor to G. Then, that last neighbor note dip down figure is taken and put into the strings in triplets as a background figure, while the low brass takes the old Dies Irae melody for a spin. These twists and turns intentionally try to lose us, but we're constantly coming back to this now very familiar melodic figure. You must be thinking now that surely there are no other ways you could expand on the same 4 notes. Well, you'd be wrong. That last A diminished chord pivots us into a key change to G minor, where the French horn now plays the Dies Irae motif in whole notes. The harmonization feels appropriately hairy for what is ostensibly the final boss fight of the game. This A chord in the key of G minor feels like a punch in the gut, and then that E flat chord layered under the last A note, the root of the chord a tritone away from the melody note, has this great, uncomfortable crunch to it. The rest of the piece is full of crunchy harmonic decisions too. A new variant of the Dies Irae motif appears in whole notes, this time starting on the root of the underlying C minor chord and dipping down to the major 7th and back. This middle major 7th note, this B natural, is harmonized with a C minor to E flat augmented to C minor move. A bizarre choice, and then the whole idea is moved up to the key of F minor. This brings us to the climax of the piece, where the music comes to a head at the end of the loop with a dramatic final variation of the Dies Irae motif. We end up on a G flat major chord that alternates back and forth with an F minor over A flat. The same F to E to F melody figure that we just saw harmonized with that weird augmented chord plays out in half notes over both chords, becoming the major 7th and dominant 7th of the G flat chord and the root and major 7th of the F minor chord. And of course, these breaks after each bar are filled in with even more Dies Irae figures jumping around the orchestra. We have ended up a long way from home, but these last couple of diminished chords offer a quick and relatively painless path back to our starting key of A minor to start the loop over. G flat this time moves to C diminished 7, which jumps to F diminished 7, which lands on an E7 flat 9, the 5 chord in our original key of A minor. Diminished chords are like a musical train hub. Because they're so dissonant and completely symmetrical, they all feel equally at home, or not at home, in any key. And because they're symmetrical, they're a perfect tool to pivot between two distant keys. They're so dissonant and unstable, and also sound so classical, that they're a perfect fit for the aesthetic of Silksong's soundtrack. And even here, in this series of diminished chords, just winding our way back from G flat to the key of A minor, we still see the Dies Irae shape used to lead the harmony. It's truly amazing how fluid this piece sounds. It doesn't feel at all like an exercise or a composition challenge, even though taking it apart, there's no way it wasn't a test by Larkin to see if he couldn't write a piece entirely using this one 4-note figure. The history behind the Dies Irae gives it so much weight, and the figure sounds as morbid today as it did 800 years ago. As the thread that's used to knit together this boss theme, it works perfectly to accompany this epic final battle. Hope everyone's still interested enough in Silksong to enjoy this video. It's such a great score. I think it's even better than Hollow Knight's. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.